Imagine inviting thousands of people to a party but forgetting to organise enough food, chairs, bathrooms. That's essentially what Australia is doing, ramping up its migration while failing to plan for the housing and infrastructure that we're going to need to support it. Now, in a recent episode of Demographics Decoded, my other podcast that I conduct each week with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher, we explained how Australia's housing and migration policies need to be aligned and what's currently happening because they're not in sync. So today on the Michael Yardney podcast, I'm replaying that particular episode. I do this every now and then because it's actually we've got a different listener and viewer base on the Michael Yardney podcast and Demographics Decoded. But if you don't currently subscribe to that show as well, why not stop for a second and just look for Demographics Decoded on your favorite podcast app? Oh, by the way, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes so you can subscribe to Simon's great thoughts that he discusses with me each week. But today we're going to explain what's ahead for our housing market. So whether you're a home buyer, a property investor, this is going to be very useful as we're going to explain the crisis that is unfolding. By the way, it's been going on for quite a while now, and unless something significant changes, what the end result's going to be. So once again, welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where I try and break through all the clutter of mixed messages to give you some clarity about what's ahead for our housing markets. So let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Now, today we're going to be diving into a topic that really just gets discussed with the urgency I believe it deserves. Why we can't keep separating our housing policy from the immigration policy if we want a proper housing market. Look, imagine inviting thousands of people to a party, forgetting to organise enough food, chairs or bathrooms. That's essentially what Australia is doing by ramping up its migration while failing to plan for the housing or the infrastructure to support it. So the conversation I'm having with Simon today around our housing crisis, for many other people, they talk about interest rates or investors or planning delays. But I think there's a critical dimension that's missing, Simon. Australia's housing and migration policies are completely out of sync, aren't they?
Yes, and it's kind of nonsensical when you look at it from afar. You go, surely these are all government policies that should go hand in glove, that should be interconnected, but they are not. And part of this might be to blame by us saying migration policy, that's clearly a national, a federal topic, and then the states, they have to solve their housing issues themselves. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. So you can always shift the blame for the not interconnected policies to another level of bureaucracy, which is quite comfortable as a decision maker. But really, it is, I feel like a broken record saying this. We must align those policies to for the best of the country.
Well, if not, it's created the perfect storm for housing unaffordability, rental stress and infrastructure bottlenecks. So, Simon, let's start by putting it into context. Let's set the context for the discussion. What's been happening to immigration and to housing starts?
So since the pandemic, we, of course, saw this massive intake of migration. So we saw this spur. Net overseas migration in 23-24 was 446,000 people. So just under 500,000 people that you add into the country just in 1 year. You know, it's roughly Canberra or thereabouts, what we add to the country. That is a lot of people. And you can, of course, excuse this in a sense by saying that overall, the net migration figures did not change all that much since the pandemic, if we take the pandemic years into account as well, because this is when we saw negative migration out of the country. And so the years since the pandemic compared to the equal amount of of time before the pandemic, we pretty much have the same amount of net migration, which is still high. So we are definitely a migration nation. We definitely take in heaps of migrants. So anyone criticizing the migration system has that on their side to say we take in heaps of people. That's definitely happening. The problem, of course, is that if we take in more people, that shouldn't be as much of a problem if we create, in an equal amount, we create new houses and new infrastructure. That, of course, we haven't done. So we have now probably 2 decades worth of allowing population to grow at a faster rate than we add housing or infrastructure. That wasn't a problem in the short term because a system like a country or a city can take in quite a few additional people without creating too much immediate pain, and plenty of people actually benefit from this. So if you shorten the supply of housing artificially, so to speak, then investors into property, they like this because their investments, they do rather well. Homeowners on paper, of course, also like the idea of their property going up rather than down in price. So there is still lots and lots of people who do not complain about this. The people who increasingly complain more and more about this are, of course, people that are being priced out of the housing market as it becomes more expensive. And these are overwhelmingly young people and overwhelmingly low income earners. And politically speaking, without being too cynical here, these are 2 groups that you can rather comfortably ignore for quite a long time.
From a political perspective,
From a
because their
political
vote doesn't count.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As opposed to, as people perspective, of course, we should pay attention to them. I guess we haven't been building enough accommodation, Simon, for a number of reasons. We had a building boom in 2016, 17, and since then we haven't been building anywhere near as many apartments or houses as we did way back during that boom. And over COVID, there were the restrictions. And then since COVID, there was also significant cost blowouts, labour shortages, planning delays, and finance costs. Finance costs a lot more. So it's not financially feasible to build all the apartments that the governments, both state and federal, are wanting us to build, Simon.
Exactly. So, which is why I'm not too happy with the simplistic narrative that it's all the greedy property developers who drive up the price. The property developers are overwhelmingly rather simplistic in their business needs. Build whatever you give, whatever you ask them to, and then they charge 15-20% on top of that. That's what they do. So, of course, technically speaking, they like higher house prices rather than lower house prices because 20% of a $100 million build is much more fun than 20% on top of an $80 million build. If you build an apartment complex or something like this, fine. But ultimately, they don't care what is being built or how expensive housing is as long as they add more supply to it. But if the building costs, if the financial costs don't stack up for an investor, the developers are not going to build them housing because somebody needs to finance the whole show. And so there are fewer projects that are feasible. Yes, if you build super sexy luxury type apartments, that's fine. There's still buyers out there for this. Yeah? The fancy downsizer apartments in Noosa or the Gold Coast, they find their market. That's fine. But if you say, why can't we have affordable family-sized apartments in the inner and middle suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne? It's like, well, because it doesn't stack up financially.
Well, interestingly, some recent analysis from the Housing Industry Association showed that property taxes have quietly become the biggest contributors to housing unaffordability. In fact, the government takes more from the sale of a new home than the builder, the developer, the land seller, and the banks all combined. It's suggested that in Sydney, regulatory costs account for close to $300,000 of the value of each property. It's less in Melbourne, where it's $156,000, and Brisbane, where it's $125,000, a bit less than the other states. But it's all the costs along the way that are sort of hidden. Levies, taxes, charges, all along the way. So interestingly, the HIA study showed that for a typical 30-year mortgage, for the first 15 years, you're paying off government taxes more than anything else, Simon.
Yeah, that's because government navigated itself into a certain corner. And so we can look at the estates first, which are the guys who collect stamp duty, for example. Like you are taking in more and more money based on stamp duty year after year. This is how you make money. And so the state goes, well, we are both in Victoria, the broke state. And of course, they're now taking more and more stamp duty each year. They're collecting heaps there because they need the money. And so they're hooked on property as an immediate income source. And to wean them off this would mean that you completely transform the tax system so that the state can take money from elsewhere. We would still be taxed in some way or form, but not through property. Maybe it could still be property if we kill stamp duty and we introduce a land tax, for example. Then it would still technically be speaking a property tax, but it would come in different increments, and they would make the initial housing much cheaper, and it would encourage right sizing for retired people that live in a big house and still pay big tax. They'd go, well, you'd encourage those people to move into a smaller property so that this family-sized house becomes available. That's one option. But so I think the punchline is the state is hooked on stamp duty, and we try to wean them off it. Well, let's look at the federal government. They are also addicted. The federal government is addicted to income tax. More than half of the tax that the federal government snatches up is income tax. So that means what is called the dependency ratio, the ratio between the working population and the non-working population. That gets ever smaller. That means we have fewer workers that produce wealth in this country for an ever larger share of retirees and, well, also younger people that don't work. Kids just yet. And so, well, what do you do then if you need half of your income, half of your tax to be income tax? Well, bracket creep is one wonderful tool of doing this. You don't change the tax brackets, you don't adjust them to inflation. And so even lower and middle income workers end up paying more tax, and they keep a smaller share of their income, that they keep a smaller share of that. And so you go, well, that means the federal government, who is hooked on income tax, they're also hooked on migration, because they couldn't possibly slow down migration, because then they minimize the number of income taxpayers. And we're already bleeding the workers dry. Okay, so we have a federal government that essentially knows that migration will be high. And then, of course, we have a state government or state governments that know that they need to make all their money with stamp duty. And this is a system we were too afraid to touch it, too afraid to make major reforms here. And so we just had this thing get worse and worse, small increments for 20 years. And you go, well, where is some sort of breaking point? What would a breaking point look like? But definitely it leads to stark social discontent in the people that are hit by it, meaning low income earners and young people.
In fact, a short while ago, Simon, when I talked about how much the various state taxes and total taxes were for property, I underestimated the total value. In fact, it's actually more than half the value of the property. I only gave some smaller figures, but there are infrastructure charges which tend to be local, because you were talking about state taxes. There are statutory taxes, the stamp duty, and there are regulatory costs as well. So they all add up. Many years ago, the local governments used to provide the roads, the sewers, the parks, and nowadays all that's required to be funded by developers, because the local governments can't afford it. And that's added to the cost of construction, isn't it? But just to go back over previous shows, and I know we've got lots of people who are watching this, listening to this, who are regulars, but every month, every week, we get lots of new subscribers as well. There are previous shows where you have discussed why we need migration more than just the government requiring taxes. So can you give us maybe a little summary? And I'd love people to go back and listen to previous shows as well to understand that. But migration is not going anywhere anytime soon, is it?
No, because we, like most Western countries, are aging rather quickly. So that means we have an ever larger share of retired people and then elderly people as well who need care, who still consume stuff. So they need a big workforce to support their consumption, and that they need this big medical system to keep them well in old age. So that drives up the demand for workers. And all the while, we're now about to retire this gigantic baby boomer generation. And as they retire, and we lose a big chunk of the workforce. And so we need to grab more people to fill those spots that the boomers leave behind. And we don't have enough young Gen Zs who enter the world of work at the other end of the spectrum. So we need to supplement this with migration. That's good. So migration in that sense really solves our workforce and demographic issues quite nicely. And so you go, well, cool. So let's keep migration high, but that means we need to fix the problems that migration creates. And migration does create problems on the housing front, as we just discussed. And ideally, you would be very open and upfront with your population about why you need migration. And then you need to have a plan for this. And you would preempt the standard criticisms about migration. Migrants don't integrate into society. Well, what you would then do is you would double down on the English language test, for example, at the visa level. So you would then soften that blow quite significantly. You could also further invest into English language education for your migrants, which is dirt cheap, by the way. So this is a very powerful and cheap way to integrate this. Of course, also, if you have international students who then turn into migrants because you hand them a visa, they already had, before they become residents here, they had 4 years in the country, where they already started to learn the Australian ways and so forth. So that could also help the integration progress. Yeah, but that's the quick gist why I don't think migration will go away anytime soon.
Well, similarly, the government was re-elected on the policy of a big Australia. So you're right, it's not going away. So what kind of housing demand is being created by the current migration patterns? And are we actually building the right homes in the right places for them?
Yeah, so the migrants that we take in are almost exclusively 18 to 39 years of age. They're overwhelmingly single and maybe coupled up already, meaning partnered up, but most certainly not families, at least on that scale. So we need relatively small households, small dwellings for those households. So also half of the migrants are international students, meaning they initially move close to where the unis are. And in Australia, the universities are near the city centers of our big cities. We don't have a decentralized university system, meaning where you have small university towns in maybe driving distance to a big town. That is not really the case. So that means new migrants almost exclusively move near the inner cities, near the one address that they know about when they come to Australia, either their uni or the place of work. So to make sure that all of those migrants are housed, we need relatively small, high-density dwellings in the inner and maybe even middle suburbs. That's what migrants demand. That is still not the main game in the housing market, because who currently occupies quite a large chunk of the smaller, high-density dwellings in the inner suburbs are the millennials who now make babies and do so for the next 12 years. And as they start their families, they move to the urban fringe because that's where the family-sized housing is available. So you need heaps of family-sized housing. 3-4 bedrooms is what those young families demand. And you need the new migrant stock housing in the inner city. So the inner city easily will want to densify, will want to go up, will want to look a bit more like New York. And all the while, we look for the fastest way to house this big millennial cohort. The fastest way of building housing remains bulldozing land on the outskirts of town and build a 3 and 4 bedroom dwelling on top.
It's also the cheaper way than building in around the universities and high-rise towers that involve cranes and unions. Now, in previous chats, you've spoken about the planning system for our housing being outdated. In your view, what's the biggest barrier stopping us matching housing supply with population?
One big barrier, particularly in Melbourne and New South Wales, or Victoria and New South Wales, Sydney and Melbourne's states, is a bit of a fight between local government and state governments. So the state can want all the housing it wants, but then the local government gets to decide whether any particular project is approved or not approved, or whether it's delayed or not delayed, so to speak. And local governments, systemically speaking, are disincentivized to allow new housing. Look at a standard middle ring suburb in Melbourne, family-sized 3 and 4 bedroom houses, and somebody wants to build a big block of units or wants to bulldoze a house and build 4 townhouses on top of something. The neighbors don't like it because they say the character of the street is maybe at risk. They say maybe traffic congestion is feared. And so they put their complaint towards the elected local official and they say, we voted you in, we don't want this. And so the elected official is very much incentivized to say, well, let's not do something that my constituents, my residents don't want. And so they block development. And then the development needs to go elsewhere. And so the development goes to the urban fringe where there are no neighbors to complain about. And we have these middle suburbs unchanged for decades. And that is now slowly changing as the states grab power away from local government areas. But that has been, traditionally speaking, a massive planning problem. If you talk to developers, they will have further complaints. They will say things like, well, we put a finished project to the relevant authorities and it takes forever for them to say yay or nay. It's just the application process takes forever. Quite frankly, in this day of age, should be a matter of hours rather than months or years. Because ultimately what you're doing is you have to be honest, outrageously long list of local regulations and requirements. It's cumbersome. It sits in many different legislations and many different levels, but ultimately it's just data. It's just data about what is okay and what isn't okay. And it is utterly thinkable that any kind of project by an AI is being checked. Do you tick these 498 different requirements? And then it tells you what it fits and what it doesn't fit. And then you can instantly react as a planning bureau. You do not need to have the authority say yay or nay 12 times and constantly push things out, because this ensures that developers have very, very long holding costs on an unutilized piece of land. And the holding costs, guess who these are being handballed to at the end?
Sure. So if you were to redesign Australia's housing and migration strategy, let's say you can start from scratch and you've got an opportunity, because I know part of what you and the demographics group do is advise policymakers as well as industry. But if you could integrate a policy, what would it look like?
Well, I'd want to very much link the national migration levels with a national housing target. And the national housing target, and this is the more radical plan that I have, would be taking a book out of the Reserve Bank of Australia's, a page out of the RBA's book. So the RBA has the inflation target. So if the inflation rate is below or above that, we need to intervene with the interest rates. And we could have this. We could say we want to ensure that housing in Australia costs no more than, let's say, 6 times the median annual income. And by now, Sydney sits at 11, 12, Melbourne at about 10. And so this would mean until we hit this ratio, we would only be allowed to set policies that drive house prices down rather than up. Once we have house prices at 5 times the median annual income, we could drive them up again if we wanted to. But so this would set a policy goal, and would also, because these aren't quick fixes, this would allow property investors, homeowners, that would allow them transparency in their decision making about when to sell, when to buy. I think that would be rather a bold thing. Will this come true? Absolutely not.
Of course not. I'm sitting here smirking, Simon, because 2/3 of Australians own a home, and they're not going to vote in a party that would do that, or they would very quickly vote out a party. But when you actually have a look at how many property investments politicians own, and they own their own home, I understand the importance of affordability, but one way is to actually bring down the cost of what's already there, or the other is to make it more affordable in other ways, which I think is probably more realistic. Of course, one of the challenges is the short political cycles we've got, haven't we? When on the other hand, you're talking about things that are long-term strategic processes.
Absolutely. If you wanted to make housing cheaper, for example, you would do this over decades. So to say we drive a housing affordability ratio from about 10 times in Melbourne to 7, that would easily take 3 to 4 decades. So it would be a very, very slow moving process. But ultimately, you need to be elected every couple of years as a politician. So you're constantly campaigning. And it's very, very easy for one party to, even if you were, let's say, you were one of the 2 major parties who wants to make housing cheaper. That is your sole goal. All the other party needs to do is just be nice and quiet. And then the 3/4 of the voters that own a house, it's even higher amongst voters, the home ownership rate, they will just vote in the other party, regardless of whether they feel more aligned with Labour or Lib. Then their own self-interest will be bigger. So the political setup as it is right now would tell me that any major housing reform or any major systemic driving down of house prices is unrealistic for the next 5 to 6 elections, which is 15 to 18 years, which is roughly when we have so many baby boomers left the voting role because they died, and being replaced by so many young people who will definitely not own a home, that the power dynamics might shift and the policy agenda might shift. But in the short term, that is not the case. In the short term, you would pull other levers to make sure that the housing policy is more favorable. We then talk about stuff like fast tracking planning and approvals. This is where I'm saying this should not be sitting there by understaffed local government areas anymore. That is scandalous. Technology can do it right now. We should technology let it, be involved in there, and approval should be done within a week max.
Now, I think another area is infrastructure planning, because we're talking a lot about houses, roofs over our heads, but really if we've got all these extra people, what about schools? What about roads? What about transport and hospitals? Interestingly, I was thinking about a conversation we had in one of our previous shows about religion and how a lot of the younger families now are not as religious, but I was talking to somebody about this in Church Street, Brighton, as we were having lunch. And the reason it was called Church Street is because there's a big church at the end of the street. But if you go to the outer suburbs, you're not seeing a lot of houses of worship there anymore, are you? It's a very different atmosphere.
Half of the population in Australia, rule of thumb, it doesn't follow any kind of religious belief, and the remainder is spread across a multitude of faiths, which is good. We cater for this. We are a very welcoming society there. That's positive, but it means that the social cohesion function of religion, that doesn't help there anymore. It also means that the church isn't as big of a player to provide social housing, for example. That's too much for them to carry as well. But in terms of infrastructure planning, for a little while, during the pandemic years, when we weren't sure whether we recover our economy after the pandemic, the states actually did write much more infrastructure planning into their budgets, which they then quietly all cut out again afterwards, because they quickly realized that recovery was possible. But they also realized that if we now finally add the infrastructure that we neglected for 20 years, we bastardize, we jeopardize the workforce that would build residential property. And so you then further worsen the housing crisis by building infrastructure. So it's a fine balancing act there as well. And of course, we're not in a country where the states kind of follow any kind of strategy or they align calendars, whether they want big public works or not, because then if all of the states announce big public works, the workforces get completely sucked up. So you suck dry the residential sector. And if all states do this, you further add to the housing costs.
It also affects how the budgets of the states. Just have a look at the infrastructure costs that have blown out in Victoria and the Victorian state budget. On the other hand, Queensland is going to be investing a lot in infrastructure with the Olympic Games coming up, Simon. Now, we know that the government has said they've got a policy that they want to build 1.2 million new dwellings over 5 years, and many of them medium density and high density apartments, and they're saying they want them affordable. Well, I'm not sure that actually is easy to do. We're seeing fewer apartment completions and more low density housing because, as you said, it's quick, it's fast, it's cheap. How's this impacting urban planning and infrastructure pressures?
Well, it'll drive up the infrastructure costs. So the reason why any urban planner across the country, pick a random urban planner, and they know what story they will tell you. They will tell you that we need to densify our sprawled out cities. We need to stop the sprawl. We need to only grow our cities by infill development. That's where we bulldoze two quarter-acre blocks and we build like 6 townhouses there. That increases the population density. We need to double down on medium and high-density dwellings, even in our middle suburbs. That is best urban planning practice because we utilize the existing infrastructure better and so forth. The problem, of course, is that this is financially not stacking up. It is much cheaper to build housing on the outskirts of town by a factor of 3. So the cost of a square meter of housing on the greenfield site of Logan in Brisbane or near Brisbane is about $4,000 a square meter. It's 3 times $12,000 if you build a medium high density dwelling in Fortitude Valley in Brisbane. And that's rough. So that just means financially speaking, it doesn't stack up to build those higher densities. So why would you build? Rather, you build further out. That's cheaper in the short term, and Melbourne will be very proud of further driving down house prices left, right, and center, making sure that we add more housing stock in Melbourne. but you also increase the infrastructure backpack that you carry year after year. So you have an ever increasing ongoing infrastructure cost with it. So in the long term, it is terrible, while in the short term, it is providing much needed relief. And of course, if these things aren't centrally managed, then you don't know where to pull. Do you want short-term pain? Do you want long-term pain? What do you choose? And so far, we just let the market run its course, and we choose to not have. We
Seems
choose
like we've got pain on both sides at the moment, Simon. Can we get any lessons from overseas? Are there other countries that have successfully aligned their housing and migration policy?
Well, it's quite easy to find the opposite problems where we have countries that failed to do so. You can do it better, of course. So Australia has a couple of countries to look for, but sometimes these are small countries with a lot of money and a lot of centralized planning. We always point to places like Singapore, a city state that very strategically uses migration, and they hand out lots and lots of temporary visas. So they have this rolling stock of temporary workers going through. It's very hard to get a permanent visa. So they weaponize their visa policies a bit more. We're not doing this as much. What do we want to do? We don't have a national migration strategy, so to speak. We're not actually aligning the demographic strategy of how old do we want to be? Where do we want to get our money from? We take international students in because they create a bucket load of money. Very, very helpful for the state. But of course, they want housing. And of course, they kind of have an impact on how universities operate and function. There are impacts there as well. And what do we do? Who do we look to as good case studies is a wonderful question. And so far, we have not found a country to look to where say we just emulate this. Canada doubled down on population growth massively. Now they had their 35 million people or thereabouts, and they have this project Canada at 100, where they say we tripled the population to 100. Now on the back burner again, but they were bold enough in thinking in these type of terms, and we are not. We still pretend that we are not growing at 400,000 people a year. Because we are afraid to actually say it and then say we need to plan for Australia that is twice the size within the next 75 years.
Well, I know you spend a lot of time advising companies, industries and policymakers. If people would like to get your advice on this, not just on immigration or housing, but on demographics, how do you help the clients that you work with at the demographics group?
Well, so we always first have a chat with clients and then understand their pain points. And then we try to very much show them what their world looks like through the demographic lens, through the demographic perspective, because there's always a demographic story. Whatever your business, whatever your local government area goes through, there is a demographic element that we can forecast pretty precisely for, let's say, the next 10 years. And we can then tell people how to adjust their marketing, their product offering, or in terms of a local government area, what they need to brace themselves for, so to speak. So it's quite astonishing how precise demographic forecasting can be in a country like Australia that operates a very, very predictable migration system. We are surprisingly stable in the statistical long term in terms of what we do.
I think it's also benefited by the fact that we've got a lot of data from the census that gives you information to work on, Simon.
Absolutely. Data in Australia is much better than it is in the vast majority of places across the world. Like nothing in Europe comes close. The US is well behind what we do. Most Asian states, maybe Singapore is great, but they don't come nowhere near what we have. So we really...
Well, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to your team at the demographics group. And if there's somebody's interested in having you consult to them or speak to their organisation, they can get in contact with you. But just to conclude what we've been talking about, I think it's a very important topic because there are some long-term risks if we don't fix this housing migration disconnect. Separating the two policies, as you say, is creating policy problems. I mean, we're getting a larger percentage of Australians who are going to never be able to afford to buy a property, and that in some ways creates an underclass of renters, and this isn't right. We shouldn't have social unrest as affordability erodes, not in a country like Australia. And it's also continuing to cause concentration of population growth in a number of cities, and that's worsening the infrastructure bottlenecks. In other words, our national prosperity is at risk, not just a property problem. Simon, if there was one thing you wished every policymaker understood about this, about linking people and places, what message would you give them?
The obvious story is to understand that any kind of policy that you change has impacts across all different types of policies. And therefore, to run a policy in isolation is madness. So if we go up with migration, if we open the migration tab, this must immediately trigger an increase in infrastructure spending. If we don't have a mechanism to allow this, we will create easy excuses for using migrants as scapegoats, which is terrible for social cohesion in this country. It also ensures that we don't build the stuff that we need. So I want these things. It's a simple, in computing terms, it's a simple what if statement. If you do this, then that must happen. And we must find ways to tax this as well, obviously, but you cannot change this without creating some sort of pain. And I want policymakers to be bold enough to stand in front of the Australian people and tell, sometimes it must be a majority of the people, to say there will be pain ahead for you. And I think the Australian people, more than any other type of people that I came across with, are capable of doing this, are willing to take a hit, a short-term hit, to make sure that life is better in the long term.
Sure. Do the easy things now, you're going to have a harder time later. Do the harder things now, and as a nation, we'll have the easier time later. So there we have it, a deep dive into why Australia's housing and migration policies can no longer operate in isolation. As we've discussed, migration does bring enormous benefits culturally, socially, and economically. But when we fail to plan where all those new Australians are going to live, we're setting ourselves up for a housing crisis that punishes everyone, renters, home buyers, and even investors. So this isn't about blaming migrants or cutting intakes. It's about having a joint national strategy that recognises the obvious. If you grow the population, you've got to increase housing supply and infrastructure and services to match. Unfortunately, our current systems seem to be reactive, aren't they, Simon? Fragmented, politically short-sighted. So I hope some policymakers, and I know a number of politicians listen to our regular show. If you are new to this podcast, please subscribe on whichever podcast channel you're watching this on. It's on video on YouTube and Spotify, audio and on the other podcast channels. And go back and have a listen to some of our previous shows as well. By the way, if you got some benefit from it, tell somebody else who you think is going to benefit from understanding what the future holds. And let's stop thinking about housing and migration as two separate issues. They're two parts of the same national challenge. And Simon, if we get it right, the rewards are going to flow, aren't they?
I think so. I think there is nothing holding Australia back in any kind of major structural way. We still have a continent worth of minerals underneath us. We can do heaps of agriculture in this land. We are a wonderful tourist destination, and we would even be ripe for the, let's call it small scale diversification of our economy. There should be much, much more growth and wealth creation in Australia's future, but we must play our cards right. And so far, just only being stuck in this housing crisis is holding this innovation power back in the country. And so I'd say solve this, and ultimately we will unlock more wealth and prosperity in this country.
Well, Simon, I look forward to catching up with you next week for our Demographics Decoded podcast.
Yes, I'll see you next week, Michael.
In each podcast, I have this property trivia quiz where I give you, my listeners and viewers, an opportunity to win a hard copy of one of my best-selling books. Currently, I'm giving away Michael Yardney's Guide to Investing, a great book that outlines the investment principles, not just for property, but I've used in general to grow my wealth. So I'm going to ask you a question, then go to propertytrivia.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes, enter your answer, and each week 3 correct answers will win a hard copy of one of my books. But don't worry if you're listening to a slightly older episode, your entry is still going to count, and everyone who leaves an entry is going to get a copy of an updated property report, and I update these. I offer different ones regularly, so please go back and get that. Today's a pretty simple question because some people said the previous questions were a little bit hard. Today, what does CGT stand for in the context of property investment? Hey, you got to know that one. What does CGT stand for in the context of property investment? Go to propertytrivia.com.au, leave us your answers, and you've got a chance to win one. I hope you got some benefit from my chat with Simon Kuestenmacher, who brings great insights into our weekly Demographics Decoded podcast. And that's again why I've played it on this particular Michael Yardney podcast. But if you don't subscribe to that show, or if you don't subscribe to this show, please just follow or subscribe in your favorite podcast app so that you get insights from both Simon and myself in Demographics Decoded and in this particular show as well. Oh, by the way, if you got some benefit from it, why not send the details of this show to a friend? Let them know about it as well. Now, clearly our markets are going to keep growing this year with falling interest rates, increasing buyer consumer confidence. But over the next year or two, as we move into the next phase of the property cycle, I see the market being very, very different, and it's going to be more fragmented. And it's likely that, I guess, only 4 or 5% of all properties coming onto the market will be what I would call investment grade. So I think at this stage of the cycle, investors should seek opportunities in undervalued markets rather than those that have had the frenzied hotspot people chase them over the last couple of years. So why not turn to the multi-award winning team at Metropole? Because we don't have any properties for sale and we can give you independent, unbiased property and wealth advice. We're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help our clients safely grow into generational wealth through real estate by offering strategic property and wealth advice. And we're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. So whether you're just getting started or wanting to grow your existing portfolio, go to metropole.com.au because we offer you a time-tested system, strategies I've fine-tuned over 5 decades to help you grow your wealth through property. And we've been through this stage of the cycle before. We know where the landmines are. We're not going to let you step on those. Having the team at Metropole on your side could mean that you're going to outperform the averages and give yourself and your family the financial freedom you deserve. Metropole.com.au and book your complimentary wealth discovery chat.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I want to teach you that you're always building your own house. Look, what if I told you every decision you made today, big or small, is laying a brick in the house you're going to eventually live in tomorrow? Look, there's a story I love about an old carpenter who told his boss that he was ready to retire. And the boss asked him for a favour. He said, look, can you build me just one more house before you go? The carpenter agreed, but his heart wasn't in it. He cut corners, he used cheaper materials, and he rushed the job. But when he was done, the boss handed him the keys and said, this is your house. It's my gift to you. Now imagine the shock. If he'd known all along that he was building his own home, he would have done it differently. Here's the thing. We're all that carpenter. Every day we're building 3 houses we'll one day have to live in. Your professional house, every email you send, every meeting you show up for, every little piece of work you deliver is a brick. Are you building something strong and to be admired, or a house full of cracks because you didn't take pride in the small things? The other house you're building is your relationship house. Every word you speak, every act of kindness or lack of it, every bit of attention you give to the people you care about. They're the nails and beams holding it together. Are you strengthening the walls or letting resentment and neglect eat away at the foundations? And the third house you're building is your physical house. Every meal, every workout, every night of quality sleep is building the house you're going to inhabit for years ahead. Are you creating a place of vitality and energy, or one of fragility? I once heard somebody say you should be strategically incompetent at things you don't want to do so people don't ask you to do it again. Sounds clever, doesn't it? But in reality, it's one of the worst pieces of advice I've ever heard. You don't get to pick and choose when you show up. Every action leaves a legacy, visible or invisible. I think Steve Jobs put it beautifully. He said, when you're making a beautiful chest of drawers, you're not going to use a cheap bit of plywood at the back, even if no one sees it, because you'll know it's there. So here's my question for you in today's mindset message. If you knew you were going to live in it forever, would you still do it the same way? My suggestion to you is take pride in small things. Nail the details, because how you do anything is how you do everything. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show. But before you move on to the next podcast you're going to listen to, let me remind you I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. We call that Demographics Decoded, where Simon and I unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. In my mind, this is a must-listen to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, but also for business people and entrepreneurs. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, just please stop for a second and subscribe on your podcast app where you're listening to this or on YouTube. And of course, if you don't subscribe to this show, the Michael Yardney Podcast, why not click the link that says follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now. So twice a week, you're going to get benefit from my guests and me. And I'd like to ask you a little favour, please. If you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody who would also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcast, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Well, just tell them about it. Just have a chat with them. Now, I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing me a favour in my quest to help as many people as possible to become financially literate. And by the way, I've got a special bonus for you. As my way of saying thank you for subscribing, just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. It's just my way of saying thank you for taking the time to listen. And remember, the information that we give you in this podcast is general information, not specific information about your personal circumstances, because we don't know about them. But if you do want specific information, you can always have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. If you really want to learn more, you can always listen to the previous podcast, the many episodes we've already published. Just go back to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success, and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?